Fasten your seatbelts for an all areas access conversation spanning a decade inside Formula One with none other than former Haas F1 team principal Gunther Steiner. Unfiltered Live is an event no Formula One fan, hell, no racing fan should miss. The star of Netflix's smash hit docuseries Drive to Survive will take you on a wild ride through his career in motorsports and his decade of working on the Haas team. And it's for one night only. November 15th, Unfiltered Live at the Cadillac Palace Theater. Tickets at BroadwayInChicago.com. Today on CityCast Chicago. 3 years ago, buses from Texas carrying newly arriving families and asylum seekers pulled into Union Station for the very first time. Now, with immigration agents violently roaming the city, we're checking in on where many of these individuals landed. It's Monday, October 27th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. I am joined today by the team from Borderless magazine, Mauricio Peña. Welcome to CityCast Chicago.
Thank you so much.
Katrina Pham.
Hi, Jacoby.
And Diane Bou Khalil. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hello. Thank you. We're happy to be here.
We've also got from Block Club Chicago, Madison Savedra in the building.
Thanks so much for having me.
Y'all are here today because as immigration agents continue to wreak havoc on the city, the Texas Republican Governor Greg Abbott is giddy to send his National Guard troops to the city, which shouldn't be that surprising to people who've been paying attention over the last few years, because back in 2022, we saw an influx of new arrivals and migrants from the southern border being sent to our city by Texas Governor Greg Abbott as this sort of political response to address his issues with border policy. And Chicago ended up welcoming approximately 51,000 new residents over those years. Mauricio, I'm going to start with you. Where are many of these residents now?
Yeah, it's hard to pinpoint exactly where everyone is at the moment. It looks different for a lot of people based on their status. And so back in 2022, when we had some of the first buses coming in, we had people with various status, or some had received asylum, others had received TPS. Some were kind of in limbo, waiting on their court case, essentially. And so fast forward 3 years later, it looks a lot different for different people. So for instance, some folks who had received the state's asylum-seeker emergency rental assistance program. If you're not familiar, it's a program that the state had temporarily to help rehouse some of the migrants that were living in the shelters. And so at one point, they were providing rent for 6 months, and then that was reduced to 3 months. And so for many of those, they had temporary housing in different parts of the city. A lot of them ended up on the South Shore. Some ended up in the West Side, and some of them continued to live in some of those affordable housing units. But a lot of them, after the program ended, there was no tracking of what happened to them. So I've had some sources who have said that they've gone to other states, Tennessee. Some were hoping to go to Florida, where they had family, some in California. So it's hard to say and pinpoint exactly where a lot of those new arrivals are at this, just because there's not overall tracking, and also because some of those individuals had their status revoked by the current administration.
How did life in Chicago look like for folks when they first got here?
One of the first words that comes to mind when we think about how this whole city's response started, it started first with buses showing up at the train station downtown. And the very first time the bus arrived, there was no coordination. And that didn't change. But as more buses came, at least the city could kind of prepare. So night one, people sleeping outside the train station all night, people on buses. And then Slowly but surely, as the months went on, the city was standing up these temporary shelters really across the city. There were some on the far north side near where I live. There were some on the south side, some on the west side. There were some downtown as well. And that really was the response for the first several months, was the city like, we gotta open up as much space as possible. Then I'm sure we all remember there were people staying at police stations, which was a completely new and unexpected and, again, chaotic situation for people to be living in. I mean, I'm talking thousands of people sleeping at police stations across the city, at the city's 2 airports, really just because the buses never completely stopped. And the city's response, they were never really able to get in front of it. It was a lot of being reactive. And to their credit, it was hard to be proactive because, like I said, there was just very little to no coordination.
We didn't know exactly when or who would be on them. We just knew that like on August 31st, a bus was going to arrive. And I remember being at Union Station. There were a lot of babies, there were a lot of individuals, a lot of families, and they were being rushed and kind of forced on to another bus. And so those who were left behind were those who maybe were waiting for a CTA, who they didn't know what that was. They had no cell phones. They didn't even have bags with them. They just had a paper or some documents with them. And I also want to mention that the migrants that came on the buses, they're not only Venezuelan who were fleeing economic collapse, political instability, and violence, but also came from Colombia, Honduras, and Guatemala.
It felt like the city was building the plane as they were responding to the crises. A large part of those early days was the patchwork of nonprofit and immigration advocacy organizations that really helped stand up a lot of the efforts in those early days. And then there was a lot of catch up on the side of the city and county officials to really respond to the thousands and thousands and thousands of migrants that continue to pour in. At the peak, it was nearly 30 different migrant shelters that were opened across the city. And of course, we saw how that ended up for a lot of migrants, where there was a lot of issues with oversight and just inhumane conditions that migrants described to us in those shelters.
Katrina, I want to bring you in here because this year in particular, we know at the very top of 2025, the mayor moved to sort of a one shelter system. And a lot of that was based on what they said was sort of the changing needs. The buses weren't arriving as frequently, but also an attempt to kind of calm the political tension around the city's management. But ultimately what ended up happening for, I think, a lot of just kind of casual Chicagoans is this stopped being in the headline. So what does it look like for most people this year as the kind of headlines in the shelters and some of that state money, all of these things have kind of dried up or left the front pages?
At the time in 2022 and the years after, when all these buses were coming in, it's like making headlines because it's so visible. But I think the challenge is that a lot of the issues that these migrants are facing still exist and perhaps are exacerbated by the fact that there's less resources available to them now. Over time, we created those systems, like we created these shelter systems, they had their issues and they still have their issues, right? But it was something, and we created rental assistance programs led by the city and the state to help people get settled. Obviously, those had their issues too because people were getting set up in subpar housing with a lot of issues because it was more affordable and things like that. But now people who are new arrivals, and I say new arrivals as if they just got here, but I mean recent immigrants, like people who came in the last couple of years or so, they don't have that same infrastructure after this merger because a lot of the programs that the city set up, they started rolling back on those because they were saying, okay, everyone who's here, they already been helped, or maybe it's less in the headlines, it's less of this crisis, right? Because people are not coming on buses day to day, and so maybe we don't need this stuff anymore. I think the reality that I've heard and spoken to people who still live in the shelters is that they still need these sorts of supports. But for the city, maybe it's less of a priority because it's less in the headlines, perhaps, or maybe there's, certainly there's less people coming in. So that's certainly something that's changed. Like there's less, at the time it was thousands and thousands of people, but they're here now and they still need support is what I've been hearing from, people on the ground and migrants living in these shelters. But the other challenge is that a lot of the support that they could receive from nonprofits, like, free bus cards or applying for certain state benefits that are available to people who are non-citizens or things like that, they've kind of exhausted the list of things that they can apply for and get. And so now the challenge is navigating life as a recently arrived immigrant under an administration that is so keen on making it immensely difficult for people of all statuses to access, work permits, to access benefits, to access things that you need to build a stable life here in the US. The Trump administration has really narrowed the pathways to legal status. And these pathways are essential for people to be able to build their lives here. There's a barrier for them to get an apartment because they don't have a credit score or something to check their credit. And you can't build a credit without having a job or having certain forms of identification and having, the financial freedom to be able to pay for certain things. And so I think that's the challenge now, right? It's less of a in-your-face crisis, but more of the crisis of living day to day and being able to, access your basic humanities.
November is Homelessness Awareness Month. Now, most of us know homelessness is a problem in Chicago. We see our neighbors sleeping in parks and bus stations, and we want to help. That's why in November, Deborah's Place is focused on raising awareness about what actually works. Permanent housing, not just overnight shelter, paired with supportive services. At Deborah's Place, that model, permanent supportive housing, has helped thousands of women find paths towards stability. When we can provide housing paired with necessary resources, our communities become safer and more livable for all Chicagoans. So learn more about events in the community and how you can support Deborah's Place at deborahsplace.org. If we said it once, we said it 1,000 times. It's spooky season, y'all, but what doesn't have to be so damn scary are your old drafty windows. Not if you replace them with Window Nation. Window Nation offers top quality replacement windows with a lifetime warranty. And if you act now, you can make no payments for 2 years. No, for real, no payments, no monthly payment, no down payment, and no interest until 2027. And if you're looking for high quality, affordable windows for your home, then Window Nation is the place to be. Get started on your free estimate before October 31st to save big on your replacement windows. Get in before Halloween. Head to windownation.com. What does it mean for people to try and build a home in Chicago when they face, immense legal challenges day to day, and now the sort of the strong arming of the federal government at their front door?
I think one way that people have really created community is, Mauricio talked about this earlier, just the way that Chicago's nonprofit and mutual aid network has really been pivotal in embracing a lot of these people who have moved to the city, over the past 3 years. Not only because the city government, didn't have the capacity to meet every single need, because I think that's just who we are as a city. The way that I saw people from around Chicago volunteer, donate money, coordinate mutual aid drop-offs and donation drives was really, really astounding. And I think one factor as to why such a diverse coalition of people kind of jumped into this volunteer mutual aid network is because a lot of these, new immigrants were coming from countries like Venezuela, Honduras, El Salvador, Colombia, which don't have longstanding like community roots in Chicago, the way that, you know, there is a very predominantly Mexican part of the city, there's a very predominantly Puerto Rican part of the city. You don't see that same level of, longstanding community for some of these other nationalities yet. I say yet because I am personally curious to see how the demographics of the city will change over the next, 5 to 10 years. But right now, that piece was missing. Whereas a lot of immigrants who maybe immigrated to Chicago from Mexico 20, 30, 40 years ago, there was this kind of port of entry, like Pilsen, like Little Village, where people already had this kind of community like baked into to where they were landing. You know, there were people who had just gone through the process and could help. That isn't quite here yet for people coming from, like Venezuela, Colombia. And I think we are seeing that same level of people rallying, like people stepping up to try to stand with Chicago's immigrant community right now. I mean, we're seeing a lot of people who are trying to help spread the word about like where ICE is being spotted, raising awareness for like GoFundMes that are trying to raise money for legal fees, for people who are being detained and need to seek, private legal counsel. So I don't know if it's necessarily the kind of community that people were expecting, but it is really encouraging to see how many people have continued to care about this issue and kind of are caring about it again as it becomes a headline again. As cynical as it is, I do think that these kinds of issues do need to be like right in front of people, right in front of their eyes, to kind of remind them that like, okay, this is actually still a big issue. Let me ask myself, like, how can I help?
I think like naturally, a lot of folks also found community through churches who were also providing support during that time, through schools, and also through WhatsApp channels to connect to other folks that were coming or providing support.
Chicago is in an interesting position because we have support from Mayor Brandon Johnson and Governor J.B. Pritzker, other local officials who are calling for the end of this Operation Midway Blitz, who are putting out Know Your Rights campaigns to protect Chicagoans to the point where, the president has called for both of them to be jailed. How else have we seen city and local politicians respond?
Earlier this year, we saw Governor Pritzker and a coalition of immigrant advocacy organizations create a hotline and kind of a portal for immigrants to navigate. It might not be as in your face, especially given what we're seeing right now, but there are efforts. A lot of it has been like these know your rights, and also like some of the things that we're hearing is like people are, going to pick up groceries for neighbors. People are picking up other people's children and dropping them off at home just because there's a lot of uncertainty of which neighborhood Border Patrol and ICE agents are going to be targeting next.
We see these aldermen and city officials, and at the state level, as you mentioned, trying to push on the levers that they can to push back on, what the federal government is doing. I think the challenge, right, is that a lot of these battles that are being fought with the government are happening on a court and like legal level. And so we're seeing like the Illinois Attorney General, for example, fighting a lot of these battles in court in coalition with other Democratic-led cities or other cities that are pushing back on some of the Trump administration's policies. So I will say on a city level, I think it is perhaps like limited, or that I personally don't know what other ways like these city officials can push back on what the Trump administration is doing, but perhaps on a local level, maybe they can focus in on greater support for people in their localities who are being impacted by these raids. An example being, that massive raid that we saw in the South Shore apartment building. In the aftermath of that raid, I think I haven't really seen the local alderperson speak out. So I think that there's local ways, right, that these aldermen can and should be responding, and that people on the ground are really feeling the impacts, right? Because all of the people who were impacted by the South Shore raid were already being impacted by challenges happening in their ward beforehand, right? Yeah, or yes, all of the people impacted in the apartment complex, like they were already facing so many issues, right, that were not even related to immigration, right? And that were just only exacerbated by this raid that happened. And so now that this raid has happened, right, there's very little support available to them, on a city level with regards to how to heal, other than, this sort of rhetoric of, we're Chicago, like we stand strong, like we're proud of who we are. But okay, we're proud, but then what happens when my entire apartment just got raided and I have no money to pay for maybe the next place to go, or I've just been separated from my family, or I have to deal with the emotional and mental trauma of like going through something like that. I think those are supports that potentially the city could tap into more if there's, avenues to like support them in that way, and that, we've been hearing that people are kind of missing.
Madison, I want to bring you in here because we've talked a lot about how much neighbors have stood in where resources are limited. What other role does the city or even CPD play when ICE is terrorizing neighborhoods and residents?
I think that's a really frustrating reality for everyone who's concerned about what's going on, is that there is only so much that government agencies like the Chicago Police Department can do. And really, maybe it's more accurate to say the things they can't do, i.e. they cannot interfere or, help out with immigration enforcement. So what that looks like is federal immigration officials conduct a massive raid. For example, like we saw in South Shore. The Chicago Police Department, because of city laws or because of our welcoming city ordinance, they cannot interfere with that. Like, they cannot be called in to assist with that. So I was actually recently at a press briefing by the police superintendent, Larry Snelling, and he somewhat addressed this. He was asked, how can the Chicago Police Department investigate or enforce potentially illegal or, overtly aggressive tactics by federal immigration officials? Things have been well documented, photographed, as well as on video, and first person account. And his response was more so like, that's not our jurisdiction. The federal government has its own investigatory enforcement body for federal agents. That's definitely a frustrating reality, I think, for a lot of Chicagoans. I think one way that we are seeing Chicago police on a lot of these scenes, and when I say scenes, I guess I mean raids that capture public attention and neighbors kind of go out to try to lend support and document it. We see Chicago police officers arriving to these scenes to help with crowd control, more or less, when there are these tense conflicts between neighbors and protesters and federal immigration officials. The superintendent said that the police department will continue to arrive to scenes like this to try to act somewhat as a buffer between federal immigration officials and protesters. Everything that's been going on in Broadview, which, just for anyone, listening that isn't aware of exactly where Broadview is, it's not in the city of Chicago. It's in the suburbs. So they have their own police department, the Broadview Police Department, that's been involved in a lot of the high conflict, high tense situations over there, as well as Jacoby, like you mentioned, Illinois State Police have also kind of been tapped in to address what's been going on there. Has it been helpful? I don't know. I don't know if I could go so far as to say that.
I think an additional challenge with the accountability piece, as Madison was saying, like the Chicago police are sort of limited, and other, local police offices are sort of limited in how they can respond to federal agents. And they have to also operate underneath our like state sanctuary policy guidelines. So a lot of the responsibility is then pushed onto the federal government, like the FBI office and the Chicago field office for the FBI. And we saw, like, for example, in the fatal shooting of Savedra Villegas Gonzalez, when an ICE agent shot and killed him in the suburb of Franklin Park. In the aftermath of that shooting, like police body cam footage revealed, one of the police officers were all talking, and someone was saying that this was a federal shooting. We can't investigate this. This is not in our hands. And I think that's the reality, is that because these are federal agents doing federal immigration enforcement, technically the responsibility should fall on federal agencies to hold these agents accountable. The reality that we're seeing is that perhaps maybe the accountability process is slow or behind the scenes, but these ICE agents are still operating with increasingly aggressive tactics, in the Chicago area. And despite, judge rulings about warrantless arrests, for example, like we have the Castañon-Nava settlement, a judge in Chicago ruled that these sort of arrests that were happening where warrants were being created for the arrests, like after the fact, was, not in compliance with the consent decree that was already put in place. And basically the judge was saying that these agents were, violating this consent decree, but they were still doing it. And that's the problem, is that like judges will say this and then DHS in court, or perhaps DHS media person, will argue another thing. And they'll say like, no, we're not doing that thing. The press people will say, no, we're doing that because of this. Like, this person was a reckless driver. This person was driving at us. What DHS is saying happened, and what literally all of the evidence that we can find so far, like, says, and that push, like, they don't align. And like the agents are kind of just operating first, asking, or not even asking forgiveness later, but just justifying these things with the narrative, right, that DHS creates for themselves.
We've talked a lot about how Chicagoans have shown up, but I know all of you have had that feeling at one point or another over the last few days. I think for anyone who's paying attention, a very overwhelming and kind of complicated time. But what do you think Chicagoans, especially those who may be listening, who don't think this directly impacts them, what do you think they should be doing and how they should be showing up?
In Chicago particularly, I think we forget that 1.7 million folks are of immigrant background. And the businesses around Chicago, our peers, our coworkers, everywhere around Chicago, they're immigrant-owned businesses everywhere. And I think supporting our neighbors, supporting these businesses and staying informed is really important. I think, immigration is definitely a local issue. It's a national issue. It's a global issue. We're all from somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I will just want to jump in on what, Diane said. Like, it is very easy to look at some of these situations and be like, that doesn't affect me. But to Diane's point, if you like eating out at restaurants, if you take rideshare, if you go to a laundromat or a auto repair shop, like, chances are that this does affect your life. Because when we target, as a country, when we target immigrant communities, we are really realistically shooting ourselves in the foot, because immigrants are the backbone, not only of the country, but of the city of Chicago. I think that's just a plain and simple fact at this point. I was having a conversation last night with somebody who kind of asked, like, what is the barometer for when you are going to start really taking action for an issue like this? Like, what is your, like, how close does it have to get to you personally before you really want to be personally invested? So I would ask everyone to ask themselves that question. Like, what is it going to take? Because, there's a quote by a favorite author of mine that goes something like, in a gradually heating bathtub, like, you will boil to death before you realize it. And I think that the bathtub is heating, guys.
I want to give a huge thank you to our guest today from Block Club Chicago, Madison Savedra. Always good to have you on, my friend.
Thank you. It was a blast, I guess. It's easier to not have hard conversations, so I'm glad that y'all at CityCast are willing to have these longer, tougher conversations.
Hey, and we appreciate y'all joining us to have them. The fantastic team from Borderless magazine, going through them one at a time. Y'all know Katrina Pham. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jacoby. It was so good to talk again.
Diane Bou Khalil, thank you for making time.
Thank you.
And Mauricio Peña, we appreciate you stopping by.
Thank you so much for having us.
Before we get out of here, please head over to our website, chicago.citycast.fm. If you ain't visited in a while, let me remind you what's there. We're updating articles almost every single day. We've got an events calendar that has something for every single person and listening. Trust me. You can also subscribe to our membership program. If you're not familiar, our CityCast Chicago neighbors get ad-free listening, access to neighbors-only events, and every week we're going to send you a special email with some of our favorite things happening in and around the city. That's my promise to you. Of course, we can't get out of here without some good news. Show Up Chicago, a community gathering and political panel show, is back at the Hideout tonight, starting at 7 o'clock. It features Baltazar Enriquez of the Little Village Community Council and Tiffany Walden from the Tribe. I'll drop a link for you in the show notes. As always, we appreciate you for listening, making time for the podcast, hopefully for the newsletter as well. We're going to be back bright and early tomorrow. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.